Grazie amici ad libertatem retis solutiones. Welcome, friends of the Libre Solutions Network. My name is Gabriel, and I am here presenting my interview with the developer of Serenum, a from-scratch operating system. If you want to know at least the surface of what I'll be talking about, I have a video clip here prepared that I will play now.
The magic of programming is largely just things you don't know yet. Once you learn those things, it stops being magic in the sense of, I have no idea how it did that or why it works. And it starts being magic in the sense of, I can make the computer do exactly what I ask it to. The point is to become the wizard, not be bedazzled. Be the bedazzled member of the audience. Yes. And I care so much about this that I have this project called Serenum, where the point is to remove all the magic, is to say, no, it's actually, compared to any modern web environment, it is way easier to understand every little detail of how, well, this computer that I sell and write all the software for, you can get this thing and you can program on it, and you can, it's not hard to learn every single bit that goes, every single ingredient in the pie, if that makes sense. You can read code in the kernel. It's very simple. You can read code in the compiler. It's also pretty simple. So it's, it's its own programming language. Everything is from scratch. Everything is self-hosted. And in total, it's less than 30,000 lines or something. We're probably bumping up against 30,000 now, but it's a shockingly small amount compared to, understanding a web browser. Understanding a web browser is way more difficult, or like any of these framework nonsense thingies that people do in webland. Those things are so much more complicated, which, I mean, maybe I can understand adds to the sense of futility, where you just say, well, this is so crazy, I'm just never going to understand it. I'm going to keep copy pasting forever. But anyway, yeah, you can, if this sounds interesting to you, you can check this out at samuelsmith.com/Serenum. You can read more. The most recent update as of recording, I developed this window manager so we can have windows and stuff, and I did all the development for that on the device itself. So like self-hosted development and like bootstrapping up to a more complicated environment.
So I think this is such a crucial message for people willing to make the technological landscape better in any way they can, that things are not hopeless. You can move past the magic and become the wizard yourself. And so I want to introduce you to the wizard himself, Sam.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And how are you doing today?
Well, I stayed up late a couple nights ago. That was a mistake, so I'm still sort of recovering from that with my sleep
I'm sorry
schedule,
to hear that.
Yeah, but otherwise things are good. I'm working on Wi-Fi right now, which is a infinite drag that will eventually be finished.
I definitely think that'll open up many different opportunities for the project. Just to rewind a little bit, since people have now seen at least a quick introduction to what it is, what really motivated you to start this specifically? As I'm sure you know, it's not a small undertaking, although you've managed to make it small.
Yeah, so it actually started with, originally I was just going to make a good Linux distro, because I was a Linux person, have been for many years. But if you are a Linux person, hopefully you know that things aren't that good on the system. It's not very usable. And especially, I had this idea that, if I can just create my own I'll create a Linux distro that will be good, and I'll fix all the problems. And then I sort of, in that process, found out that that is a hopeless endeavor, in my opinion. And then I started this project instead.
What makes that hopeless? Is it just that there's too much?
Yeah, it's that. There's too much going on. It's you even something so similar or so easy. It's too big. And your ability to do stuff is so much lower when you're working with this large volume of other people's code and other people's stuff, which I think I've demonstrated now. When you have something that's small and that you can tinker with, your progress can be much, much faster.
Right, and you're definitely quite opinionated about many different choices you make. There are many particular details. I will admit, even myself, it took me a little bit. I booted up the Serenum device. I actually have it here. If I unplug it from the video cable, that is pretty stuck, but this is what it actually looks like. It is this small box, and it's quite fascinating. Though I did notice the keybinds are probably not what I would set, but I do think they're useful to have. You know, you definitely want keybinds, because I realized it doesn't recognize USB hubs. So if I had my mouse plugged in at
Yeah.
the same time, that was a problem, which actually was informative because I saw a video on how USB works under the hood, and now I have a better appreciation for why that actually is the case. But in your opinion, what sets Serenum apart from other from scratch operating system projects right now, like Redux OS and Serenity OS?
I think the fundamental difference is that Serenum's end goal is not just to be about software, but is about simplifying hardware as well. And that's not something that I can do right now because, if you want to make hardware, you need to have such large volumes. But the goal is not to say we will do what's required to run on all these devices that exist. It's that we want to I want to produce the entire platform. That means, in the end, producing the devices and the code that runs on top. And that's how you can guarantee this, have it be simple. Um, and I think the biggest evidence for that is take Redux. I believe Redux is started in 2014, and I don't know how many people use Redux today. It's been almost basically a decade of development, but it doesn't feel like a decade of development, right? You know, in the 60s, in 10 years you could go from having no space program to landing on the moon. 10 years should feel very different, and I think with Serenum, 10 years will feel, at least hopefully, more in that direction than something like Redux or what is the norm with these other projects.
I mean, I definitely hope you're right about the timeline. You've got a lot of ambition for this project. I even noticed in your Discord community you were hinting that phones may be something down the line. I'm
Yeah.
curious, in general, what you think about when it comes to providing the entire tech stack. Not just, oh, I've written a couple of layers of software on top, but no, you're going down to the transistor level almost to really build the entire ecosystem from the ground up. Considering that you're seriously attempting this, how out of reach do you think this is for people who are taking learning programming seriously?
Um, do you mean writing software that's that close, or
Yeah, precisely.
making? Right. So, in terms of the biggest difficulty, is just that all this hardware is really, really complicated in ways that, to me, don't make sense that much. Take for HDMI. You have this weird thing where, okay, so from my computer to the monitor, everything is ridiculously standardized. But from my software to the HDMI cable, it's completely not standardized, and on every system, it's an incredibly complicated thing to do. You know, there's an enormous amount of effort that goes into just being able to operate an NVIDIA GPU to bridge that gap, right? When and if you want to use the GPU features, that's different. But say, because CPUs are so fast, you could imagine just saying, I want to just render on the CPU, and I want to put out an image over this HDMI cable. That is incredibly difficult to do, even though the task that's being done is very simple. So I think that's the biggest difficulty. It's just these things are very, very complicated for not much reason. You also have the problem that there's a lack of information. So even if it could be quite simple, you have the situation where okay, I'm on this SoC. It has this device for example, the SD card controller. And the other guy who programmed this, where I'm lucky enough to have a driver to look at, he wrote this code in 2013. I've tried, you can try email the company. I haven't received any responses yet. So if the path I've taken is, okay, if you have Linux source code and you can look at Linux, use the device, then you can, with tremendous effort, get to operating the device yourself. If you don't have that, I have no idea how these Linux people reverse engineer devices from the beginning. It seems incredibly hard.
Well, I recently saw a fancy video where somebody was trying to reverse engineer a RGB keyboard where they had Windows running in a virtual machine, was capturing the network traffic, and was just trying to reverse engineer how do I change the lights on the keyboard? That is a relatively simple device with a relatively simple set of parameters. And even that had a lot of things done for him because keyboards, like you say, are standardized in ways that maybe other peripherals aren't, which definitely raises the barrier. And to me, what really brought me on to finding out about your project is I've really been looking at learning lower levels of the software stack. Again, not, Python or Rust or many of the languages people have heard about, but how does the system actually write machine code? How is it processed? And I've played around with microcontrollers a bit, really just trying to wrap my head around this complexity. And the challenge I see is that many programmers are honestly just taught to make fancy web applications. And one of the things you're somewhat vocal about is that at the risk of putting words in your mouth, it sounds like most programmers are taught wrong and it makes them useless in many different endeavors.
Um, well, yeah, you have this weird thing where these are not new things I'll be saying, but software as a discipline is so young that probably most, we could disagree on whether the ideas are good or not, but we can agree that there probably hasn't been that much evolutionary pressure, so to speak, for good ideas.
Mm.
It's more that, well, and as well, there's been explosive growth in the field. There's, the weird thing where the stereotype of a programmer is a guy in his 20s. And that's not because the old people aren't there. It turns out that if you had just exponential growth in a field, all the people who were programming in 1980 are still
Fascinating.
around, but there are just so few of them. And this has lots of other effects. We make a technical decision, and then there's nobody around 10 years later to evaluate if that was a good idea or not. I know in the early 2000s, XML was new. I think probably just by the fact that the web took off and the web happened to use HTML. And then XML is something that looks kind of like HTML. And so XML was popular because it was like HTML. And then there were lots of ideas people would say about, oh, well, if you use XML for your file format, you'll get all these benefits. And then 10 years later, when none of the benefits have materialized, you're just using XML because that's what you inherited. Then there's nobody there to check the assumptions and say, well, we said that XYZ was going to happen from using XML. None of this turned out to be true. Let's reevaluate and get better, because the people who made the decision are gone. The people who are now working with some code base just know, well, we use XML because the elders passed down the use of XML to us. We don't know we don't know the reasons they chose this originally, etc.
Well, if it works, don't. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Right? Is the adage that has certainly seeped in. Whether it makes sense or not, I think you're definitely right that the cost of not thinking about these things seriously is actually quite high. I saw a fascinating video recently that was explaining if you can make your software run a little bit faster, you actually get huge gains in hardware capability because people debate about whether Moore's law is actually slowing down, but let's pretend for a moment that it isn't, or even that it is and that it's not that big a deal. If you can still go back 10 years in time by making your program twice as fast, which is actually seemingly not that hard a goal with how bloated everything is, because we are just stacking layers and layers on top, which is why most people will notice that despite, many of them using computers for a big chunk of their lives, they don't seem to be getting any better. And so I definitely think you're right about at least the desire to look at everything from the fundamental level. How can we sear it down to its basic aspects and really figure out what's worth keeping, what works? And I like that on your YouTube channel, you definitely reference many of these techniques that are talked about in the programming space that is not something that you would see challenged in most, say corporate environments or even probably academic environments, because I think there is a bit of a cargo cult mentality going on where if everybody gets the money doing the web developer stuff, nobody's going to question how much, oh, well, are these practices really better for us overall? And I think this touches on many serious issues that I care about, where if we want people to seriously tackle the problem of government surveillance in all our devices. In my opinion, that does require us to look at the transistor level and everything in between, which is in no part a small job, which is why I definitely think you're not wrong to say, well, maybe Linux itself is too big, although sure, in the meantime, it absolutely works. I'm running a Linux system for myself at the moment, but I do think as far as the long-term vision, you have a very serious contribution in the sense that if we can get this something that people can wrap their heads around, we can make more progress rather than just leaving everything as it is and pretending that the sky is not falling or that the ship is not burning, which is your metaphor from the presentation you did at that conference recently. When it comes to the cargo cultishness, I think a big part of the problem in this space is that for what you're doing, as far as I'm aware, there's not a whole lot of money in it. You're not getting big sponsors from big tech to try out this whole new direction. Am I right?
No, no, not at all. Um,
Um, yeah, go ahead.
well, we so far it's just I think it's important to, when doing something new like this, if there's no financial energy behind it, it actually can't happen. Which is why instead of, I think if you made something that's free software, as laudable as I think that may be, I don't think it's going to go anywhere because in the end, I want to produce hardware, and that definitely costs money. So if you don't have some way of funneling funds towards that, that's not going to work. Um, there's also this aspect on the cargo culting, though. I think actually humans are very good at actually intuiting what do I need to believe to be true to maximize my chance of getting a job and fitting
Mm.
in corporate culture, as opposed to what is true in some fundamental computer sense.
Yeah, I definitely think that's an important phenomenon, thinking on a little bit more closely as time goes on. Just to go back to Serenum, though, since you're at least a little ways into it, what lessons have you learned while building it? Because I think in many ways this project is fascinating from an education standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, the big one to me is, well, first off, uh, do not presume that the design you have in mind before you start doing something will be the correct solution. Actually, when I way back originally, it's actually before I started the project, I think I was interested in RISC-V, and I emailed one of the companies, I think a Taiwanese company that make RISC-V designs, and they have test chips where, if you're a researcher, you can get one of these cool test chips. And so I thought, okay, let me write an email and try to convince this guy that I'm a researcher and that he should send me one of these test chips.
A bold
And
move.
I ended up referencing, in the email I sent, I referenced Casey's Murato's 30 million line problem talk, which is relevant to this. And then in the response I got from him, he said, okay, I watched that talk. Very interesting. What would you do to fix this? Well, and then that prompted me to think about how would I fix this, and I came up with some solutions that were absolutely horrible. This is,
Oh
now with
no.
my experience, I know that these were really, really bad ideas, and so I sent this email to him, and then I received no reply because I'd obviously burned myself. I indicated that I was a total bozo in this regard. But then that bug of sort of in my head of thinking about it, I basically could never stop. So it's 2 months later that I actually started saying, okay, if I let me try test this idea. And so this is the project that I was essentially doing before that became Serenum later, which was, okay, if I write an operating system in a VM, but I allow myself to modify the VM to make the OS simpler or easier, how would that go essentially? Because then and then the idea was that, well, maybe if I do this, and then we could have users of this operating system that runs on this fictitious, non-existent virtual hardware, that then you could go to people or to investors or whatnot and say, oh, I actually want to make this hardware that so far is just pretend and non-existing.
Fascinating. Why was that direction you didn't take in this case, and you did end up moving to RISC-V then?
Yeah, because, well, it turns out actually running something in a VM has several problems with it. It's also hard to imagine. There's some weird effect where when it's real, it's real in a way that, and it becomes sort of exciting in a way that doesn't exist otherwise. And it also happened to be, I basically got to the point with this virtual operating system where I wanted to start writing programs within it, but I didn't want to port a C compiler because this was all written in C. And that's when I said, okay, let me write a programming language compiler. I've never done that before. And so then I created the programming language compiler that was first in C, then I self-hosted it. And then in January, say, of 2023, I went to re-implement the entire operating system in the programming language. But this time, I wanted to do it on real hardware. And so I actually got myself a RISC-V SBC thing to start programming on because, and then that turned out to be the correct direction because now I have a computer that's real that I can use, right?
Right. And I just want to clarify for people in the audience who may not notice the difference, but we talk about self-hosting in this context, and this is very different than the idea of just running your own software for your own purposes. Self-hosting in this sense is that the system itself is able to actually, say, run and build the components that you're putting on it, and so it is creating the ecosystem within itself very much, and that's really a non-trivial achievement in my opinion. I think you've created something that is fascinating on a really intellectual level, and I think it's a great starting point for somebody willing to learn about these things. As you say, it's pretty open. I myself, when I booted up my system, I noticed that the documentation was on the SD card, so I copied that over before booting it up, and I will say it's really quite elegant and fascinating, because to me it really did feel like a brand new experience. You're not going to get the same kind of thing anywhere else. It's simple enough at the moment, but it's also got enough features that if you're really just writing things out, whether it's programs or even documents, it's not, the same comfy, shiny experience people are used to elsewhere, but it works. And that's, to me, is something fascinating, considering it is such a small project. It is something you've done entirely single-handedly, more or less. And I think that's really worth celebrating, because to me, that is dispelling the magic. When you understand it through and through, if something happens, you know why. This is something that's very hard for people who are working on small pieces of really large projects. I will say, one of the things that fascinated me about your community, and also the first thing when I started up the board, is that you do lean on Latin quite a bit, hence the Latin introduction at the start of this interview. Why Latin, and what are your thoughts about using it as at least part of the project?
So this actually started with some of the audience will be Luke Smith followers. He doesn't make videos anymore, but I originally started learning because he said you should learn Latin. It'll be super important for you, or it'll be, you won't regret it. And so I started learning, and then at some point I was doing this project as well, and my time was getting split between learning Latin and working on the project. This is even back when it was a virtual machine kind of thing. And I thought, okay, let me just, as an experiment, I'll write code in Latin because then I'll practice both at the same time, and I'll sort of induct myself more in that way. And then what happened to me is I had several experiences of when I taking an English programming term and when translating it into Latin, it just clicked for me. Or there are insights about the things that are way clearer when the words you use are more accurate in a way. And the best example of this is the word for a pointer. So, okay, when a pointer in programming is I have something that points to other memory, and the word for pointer in Latin is index, which you go, wait, what? Index is that thing I use to. It's that thing I used to point into a slot in an array. And then you realize, oh my God, that's why my index finger is called the index finger, because it's the one I point with. It's what I use to indicate with all these things. And it also, I think, which was great, there's this video John Blow made about Rust programmers, because Rust programmers think that you shouldn't use pointers. Pointers are dangerous. And then in the context of game dev, what they do for some of these things is, hey, look, there's Rust is good because it made me move to this smarter design where instead of using pointers, I use big arrays with indices into the arrays. And he spends maybe an hour and a half talking about how no, you actually the index is still a pointer. You just you've backdoored the borrow check into not understanding that what you're doing is pointers and a memory allocator. But of course, if you have the right words, you don't need to watch this 1 hour lecture, right? You got the wisdom from the words being the same. And that and a couple other experiences like that just made me decide to, okay, I'm going to go down this route because I think it'll be beneficial.
Well, I will say I learned Latin in high school. I took one course of it one semester, and I found it a fascinating language. I certainly think it's a good pick as something to include. There's a lot of rich history, associated with it. And on top of that, I do think, especially something I noticed when I was taking it as a course, though I'm certainly not very familiar with it these days, it is something that the precision absolutely does matter. You can say things honestly quite quickly that are way more precise than somebody could say honestly in a paragraph of English words. Now, maybe that's uniquely an English problem. I don't know how other languages treat the same kind of problem. But what I find, again, quite fascinating about that flavor on this project is that it does add to the flair of exclusivity to it. I would argue you're probably not filtered if you're a, somebody decently comfortable with computers. You'll figure out the Latin words as you play around with it. I did found, when I booted it up, it was quite helpful in the sense that you do have the tab button to auto-complete words. It does kind of remind you, oh, by the way, this command on Linux is actually this other one. So there are a lot of helpful tips to really get started. As far as the air of exclusivity goes, I actually was quite honored when I reached out to you about this interview and you said you were actually taking a look at some of my stuff and you had some interesting comments about network states, which in my opinion definitely overlaps with the exclusivity point.
Oh yeah, well, so I saw some of your commentary on network states, and what's interesting is I several years ago now I accidentally stumbled upon the network state book by Bajali, and just after having stumbled upon it, just devoured it. Right, there was no stopping. It was one of the most interesting things I've seen. And for those who don't know in the audience, basically it's this book about how would you create a new country in the 21st century. And it talks about a bunch of, I think there's a lot you can gather from the book, even though
I would agree with that.
maybe you don't want to, yeah, if you don't want to take the concept the whole way. One of them is just, for example, on the internet today we have currencies that aren't controlled by any state, which is something that is completely unimaginable from in previous years. And well, I actually just think it's useful in that if you want to have more privacy and liberty, like we do, especially with our software, I think the useful lens is to say, well, if I want, it's more effective to take these things somehow through technology or through the power of the network, right? Than it is to sort of wish for the states to not take them from you. One of them, for example, is, hey, if I can just encrypt my communications, then I don't need to worry about state censorship, because that's just a power I've taken for myself as opposed to asking for it. And so the idea is, I have several things I want to build for Serenum once Wi-Fi is in, that sort of strengthen this ability or give more tools for online communities to act in a more, let's say, more engaged way. You want to raise the amount of engagement and the amount of coordination people can have online. And well, that just to me is a very genuine, interesting topic to think about.
I definitely agree, especially on technology changing the meta. And I would say that is one of the more important points from that book. There are other writers who will make similar comments, cough, cough, Ted Kaczynski. And the sad truth of the matter is that the cypherpunks, the people who really pushed hard on the everyone should have encryption front, were definitely right that you can't just, like you said, trust governments to respect various boundaries. If they have a interest in violating those boundaries, they will find a reason or find a pretext to trample on that when convenient. And so the cypherpunk mindset was really, how do we build tools and make them accessible enough? Because if you have a tool by yourself, it's fundamentally not that useful, but build and distribute the tools so that everybody can have these defenses that would make those kind of encroachments impossible. These days, I do kind of wonder how naive that was in a world and an environment where all these tech platforms are dominated by not just institutions, but governments themselves. It's really hard to see even the devices we use as that separate from our governments and how they all meter this out. I wrote about the EU's next generation internet initiative, where they're funding
Yeah,
a lot of
yeah,
excellent open
yeah,
source projects, and that touches down to the hardware level. Like, there is a whole lot
yeah.
going on. And
Well, there's this double between, they fund lots of interesting projects, and then also there's chat control things
right,
happening where they
right,
might, um, yeah. I think what's interesting to me is there was this idea that, oh, if we decentralize, then that's good because we take power away from big organizations that can be oppressive in various ways. But the thing the failure mode of that is, okay, well, if we decentralize, we all end up alone, and then you're not in a very
right.
strong position because you're isolated. And that's to me, what's interesting about the concept of the network state is the idea of re-centralization. You're not for centralization. It's not centralization, not decentralization, but re-centralization is that you go through decentralizing so you can form new bodies of many people coordinating together, because I think it's still true that a large group of humans who are cooperating is a way more powerful force than a bunch of isolated people.
Right. And I'll say, as somebody who's given this issue a whole lot of thought, that's one of the things that attracts me to your project. Is you're clearly somebody who does see the entire long campaign of where we're at and where we would like to be technologically. And that is a serious discussion that I find many people, especially in the Web3 space, are terrifyingly naive about. They honestly think, oh, if I just install this new smartphone app, everything is fixed. And I'm like, no,
Yeah,
no, that can't possibly be
yeah.
true, especially with what we're up against. And I will admit, my comments and writing about the network state concept was largely a reaction to the conference I had kind of powered through. It was like an 8-hour long
Mm.
conference. I had powered through the whole thing. And the thing that terrified me the most about it, admittedly, was not necessarily the techniques, the various applications that were talked about, but it was largely about where the money and the people really pushing this forward were kind of coming from. You know, Vitalik Buterin was there, and there was a lot of talk about here's how we can use network states to basically dismantle governments and to seize up all the power and control for ourselves, because that's certainly how it sounded in that discussion. But you're definitely not wrong. There are ways to kind of play the game as it's going on right now, where things are changing. We don't get to put, you know, all this technology cats back into the bag, so to speak. We do actually have to play the game as it exists, and this is a huge reason why, despite my greater concerns about network states, I am a huge fan of your project, and I do want people to be aware of it, because changing the foundation to me is clearly the key to changing the big picture problems, because we have to start somewhere.
I would say there's one difference, I think, probably, is that I am very suspicious of the idea of removing humans. There's one strand
Right.
in this sort of thing that's, oh well, if we remove humans as much as possible, then things will be fair. And I agreed to that to some extent, but you end up with this thing where, okay, we're going to have an organization, a DAO, say a distributed autonomous organization, I think it's called, and it's going to have no leader, okay, but somebody has to lead it. So we'll have voting, but then everything's going to be, you know, we vote, and then there are contracts. But the problem is, if there's no human leader, it becomes not very effective. But it also becomes, you can't appeal to the rational faculties of a smart contract, right? There's actually there's some humanity missing from that kind of organization. And I think what interests me is, how do you build networks, say, or how do you re-centralize around a fundamentally human structure, but that still is this sort of internet-enabled structure. But I think your caution is very important. Like, for example, I'm in complete agreement that, you know, Bitcoin is the best thing ever when it comes to governments, because it's completely traceable, right? But on the other hand, something like Monero is absolutely amazing, because well, it's the exact opposite. Monero is what people think Bitcoin is, right? An actually cryptic currency.
Right. Yeah, I saw a tweet to that
And
effect where if you read someone the Bitcoin white paper and it said peer-to-peer digital cash, which token do they think would actually be the peer-to-peer digital cash of today?
yeah, yeah, no, exactly. There's also, what I think is impressive about Monero as well, is Monero has a surprising amount of coordinated action around it. There's a community of both developers and supporters that are all, everybody is aware of the mission. You know, there's constant work happening the whole time to make Monero even more secure, even more private, without you know, taking too much risk, etc. And it's interesting because that's a very human organization that's around Monero, that somehow is distributed on the internet, but still is coordinated among itself. And doing more of that is something I'm interested in.
Well, absolutely, because I notice for many people who even aren't technical, who don't care too much about the finer details, them simply having people who care about privacy in their circles can really help them out. Because I notice in general, like for instance, in the free software space, one of the reasons I trust that community a fair bit is because if something is seriously wrong, for instance, recently people have just found out that the Signal Messenger is storing its encryption keys on the desktop clients in plain text so other applications can read
Right.
it. This is a terrifying thing for many people. People are screaming from the high heavens about this. And the thing I notice is that when there is, you know, to be honest, a commercial interest, there is tends to be an incentive for many organizations to put their, you know, bottom line ahead of the idea of being transparent. And so I find, at least in a more open ecosystem, it's very easy for these kind of problems to be swept under the rug. So I do think it's important to have advocates in your human network who care about whatever the issues are. It can be health, it can be privacy, it can be, financial stuff, it can be all kinds of things. But as you say, when you bring the human element to it, you get to actually embed human values into your information landscape, which I think is one of the more crucial parts of liberating your mind. Ironically, this particular problem, the Signal desktop where the file was read by other applications and that's easy to move around, could not happen on Serenum even already because
Yeah.
of a system you've built in of special file handlers and how the operating system deals with various programs.
Yeah. So let's start with why it is this way on normal systems. So back when they invented Unix, they wanted to, in a very practical way, they wanted to get things working as quickly as possible. And the best way to do that was to say, hey, the programs I'm running often, and that's what's interesting as well. Often the programs I was running, I wrote them often.
Right.
So it was completely natural to say that the programs I'm running, they're an extension of me. They get to do what I'm allowed to do. And so they had file permissions around people, which is I'm not allowed to touch somebody else's files on the same machine, but I get to touch my files and any of them. The problem is today that translates into any program I run on my computer can do anything with my computer, essentially. Encrypt my files, in this case, look at, these keys. And that's just a very bad place to be. On Serenum has been designed from the ground up to say, no, the program is not the same thing as the user. And the program by default cannot access anything on the file system and has to mission for every file. This is not, the POP says, is the program allowed to access your local file? Yes. This is when the program was open a file, you want that, say that question up to a file or some program you trust. You can say, I want to open the file particularly, and then you get that thing. And the reason I would have
I'm just
actually
going to
made the
interrupt
same.
for a quick second because you are breaking up here. And just to recap, what you mentioned is that programs themselves have their own files more or less, and they cannot see other programs' files unless it is explicitly allowed to. And I'll let you continue. Hopefully that clears it up.
Yes. So they have to be explicitly allowed to access the files. And there's actually a reason. There is a solution for this on Linux, but I understand why the Signal people decided not to do this. Although obviously what they've done is a security flaw, which is on Linux you have this complicated set of key ring managements. And so if I'm going to store secrets, because if you put it in a file, then anybody can read that. You have to do this weird handshake where, okay, I'm going to ask some service for the keys, and then that's going to encrypt that on disk with a password that's presented to the user. And then now you have pop-ups that come up every time that are sort of annoying. On Serenum, we have this thing where any application, any GUI application that you would launch from a start menu or something similar, just gets a directory that only it can access. You can obviously access it if you want to inspect it, but every program has like a secure box where it can put things like keys, and it can put them in plain text, and that will not be a problem as far as security is concerned.
And one of the things I find fascinating about this is the reason why I was looking at a video for how to reverse engineer USB devices, because I have a YubiKey. I really love hardware tokens, and I have actually even some free open source versions like the Solo Key as well. And I think that model of having a device that isn't able to be remotely seized and hacked is really helpful for many different online services and accounts. And I was thinking, like, maybe down the road, once I really understand Serenum and I understand USB a whole lot better, maybe I could build a library for the USB key, and then I could create a clickbait title. I'm working on the most secure system ever, something like that effect. And the thing I've kind of noticed is about this system most and foremost is by starting at a lower foundation. Maybe it might be easier to simply build a new security key with Serenum in mind, because, like you say, by building hardware in a different way, you can actually set a new foundation. And speaking of that new foundation, where it's heading, I know you hinted at you're working on Wi Fi, but where do you feel things are now, and where do you think things are going to be going in the future for this project?
Well, actually, the thing I've been most excited thinking about is, well, once I get Wi-Fi set up, then we can communicate with the internet, and we can. I'm not that interested in communicating with existing machines, although you could do that. What I'm more interested in is just saying, okay, let's keep going on the rethink everything train and build some new interesting systems. One of these interesting security problems you have is, okay, when you on a Linux machine connect to a server, first I establish a TCP connection with the server, but that link is not encrypted. So then the server will send me an encryption key. We do a public private key. We do a key exchange to establish a secure connection. But you have this problem where you can have a man in the middle attack, which is that somebody sits in between me and the server I'm communicating with and can intercept that setup and basically make it so that I communicate encrypted to the man in the middle, and then he re-encrypts it with a different key to the server. And then the way we solve that is something called certificates and SSL, TLS. And well, basically the solution is you have on your Linux machine a bunch of certificates from Google. And then when you connect to the website, they send you a certificate that's been signed by a certificate authority, which is a centralized police, essentially, that you trust that
Right.
centralized police. And then that you can verify that, oh yeah, this is one of those official certificates that's been signed by the certificate police. I know there's no man in the middle. That's of course super dangerous. Well, there are recorded cases of the certificate authority, behaving badly. Obviously, Google can basically at any
Right.
time swap all your certificates because they have the permission to install new certificates in your machine. And so I've been working on rethinking how would you do this in a better way, and I think there's actually this should be combined with DNS, right? Because DNS we
Mm.
used to we have some system for looking up names. I want to connect to Bob. Well, I need to know Bob's IP address. So we already have the system for, well, I need to find out the IP address. And you can combine with that, say, okay, for anybody I want to connect to, I always need their IP address and their public key so that I can do encryption with them. And then, if you start out with that premise, I think you end up in very interesting different places. But it's fundamentally not going to be compatible with the existing internet in any way. So it'll be the
Right.
new serene internet that we'll be creating from this.
I'd definitely be remiss if I didn't mention, because I talk about this with a lot of technologists that I, care about these kinds of things. And definitely the assessment is certificate authorities are a dead end. We're not going to fix this problem. And so most of the solutions to these problems of abusive certificate authorities are generally solved by overlay networks. You have the Tor network, which is what most people are familiar with, I2P, the Invisible Internet Project. And there's also a new, really starting up system that I found called Reticulum, where how they handle this is they create an end-to-end encrypted connection at the network level, kind of like what you described there, and they give everybody an IPv6 address that is globally routable, and then it handles the encryption within the system. And fundamentally, I think you're correct that that ultimately is the solution. And yes, that does have serious problems for the future of the web or the free and open web, because it may not actually be that the web that people are used to connecting to will be the web of the future, especially for those who are interested in censorship resistance and at least actual independent information. which is actually why I've spent a good amount of time trying to emphasize static site generators, because I think that's a good strategy in recognizing that the web can just be data. You don't have to worry too much about the protocols.
Yes,
You don't have to
yes.
worry too much about whether you're running WordPress or some other server. It's like, no, this is just the data I want to move from here to there and have available to my friends, which is another reason why the Libre Solutions Network, my website, is mirrored on Tor and I2P as a way of demonstrating, look, there are multiple ways of doing things. And as you said, there probably will have to be a Serenum internet that will have its own unique culture. Fundamentally, that's going to happen organically no matter how many people get on. And it does make me wonder what will happen to the original web. As most people are aware, will it just evolve into corporate ecosystems and everybody will just move elsewhere? I have no idea.
Well, you already had this problem where I can never find the interesting content on the normal
Right.
internet. And so, well, it's interesting how these ideas flow into each other. I'm going to be jumping off several things you said there. The first one is, of course, the websites with information that I want to read should just be information that I read. They shouldn't be a program with code that's running. Although you want that sometimes, and that's a separate use case. And so for Serenum, absolutely my plan is, the normal web, you want some form of static web that has guarantees about being static, right? There was, Gemini was a thing people were
Yes.
doing a couple of years back about this. But yeah, you want some version that's, okay, look, I just want to present information in a static form. Now, that's very close to PDF, which is something I also very dislike and want to get rid of, because PDF is insanely complicated. Did you know you can embed video in a PDF or a web page?
This sounds
Uh,
like a security
yeah.
nightmare.
Yeah. Well, and there are known backdoors of, I think, some vulnerability. Somebody sends a bad PDF and then it got opened in Acrobat in a way that was able to infect the machine. Absolutely crazy. So you want to redo PDF because it's very complicated. But say if you even were okay with PDF, because most PDFs are fine, right? You load a PDF, it's a static document, it's what you want. You could make a PDF web today, because PDFs can have links in them. And for
Right.
example, in my browser, Firefox, I can from Google click a PDF link and that just opens in a tab. So that's an interesting concept there. And then what's interesting is, because Serenum is designed around this model that, hey, you should be able to run programs just on your system that you don't trust. It's interesting. One of the reasons we need everything to be free software today is because if it's not free software, it's basically a backdoor to my machine, because it can
Right.
access everything and it can connect to the internet. But if you have good security, then suddenly it's, oh, I can run a proprietary program. And okay, I can't modify it. That's sad, maybe. But I can run it and it can be secure. That means now your version of the dynamic web can just be, well, I just auto download a program and then it runs in my browser, because you have an actually secure operating system. Instead of this, think about it, right? People say this, the browser is the operating system. So you have your operating system, and then you boot the browser, and then you run programs in the browser instead as the second layer. That's interesting. And then the third thing I wanted to mention is, we have this problem with certificate authorities, but I think fundamentally there's no way to solve the man in the middle problem in a convenient way. With it, you need some side channel by which you establish authority, and that could be on, some encrypted messages. You get I think, like a matrix might do this. I seem to remember where, I'm on the phone with you, and and we connect on our messages, but to make sure there's no man in the middle, I have to be on the phone and say, okay, I see a dog, a cat, and a banana. Do you also see a
Right.
dog, cat, and a banana? Okay, great. That means there's no man in the middle.
I mean,
But
people
that's the
complain
very
about it, but it
yeah,
works.
you have to do it. Yeah. But that you can do that with your friend. If you want to connect to a website, you can't phone up the website and say, hey, what do you see on your end, etc. And
Right.
so I think the you can combine this concept of, okay, I need I need a central authority fundamentally, but it doesn't have to be one authority. If we already have this thing where if you're a Discord user, you notice that, oh, I'm in several Discord networks, and then it's interesting that you can actually you can DM somebody if you share a Discord server, and that will go through and it's not spam. And so you can combine the idea of, okay, I want to have these networks and have them be official and realized. You can combine that with the DNS problem and the encryption problem where, well, okay, if I'm, say we have a Libre solutions network, which you would be the head of, then you would maintain basically a chain, like, a write-only database over time that you secure with your key. And that can include information about people and servers in it. And then on my Serenum device, if I can import your network, where I say, hey,
Right.
I'm going to import the Libre Solutions network. I trust Gabriel. I trust this key. And then that's like a local certificate authority that both tells you about, hey, here are all these websites that are of note and maybe you should check out. And also here are the keys and how you communicate with them. And also here are people, like in the Discord case, here are people that you could talk to and that are real people and not bots, etc.
The Discord parallel is really important, I find, because many people, when they talk about this way of solving the problem, for instance, I think that could be called a web of trust, though I don't know if it technically meets the definition. The thing is what ends up happening is because it's technologically complicated, people assume that it cannot be made easier for the user and look simple in actual use. And so I do think those things are separate, and it's absolutely possible to have complicated schemes like that that are just as easy to use. And to defend it a little bit, right now on my own machine, as you said, I have this basically folder of certificates that are given from either Google, Mozilla, or whoever else has access to my distributions certificates folder. And the problem is I don't actually know one certificate from the next. I can open them up and see, it's signed by who and what it's for. But the problem is that, like you say, there's no aspect of trust. So you could then have a certificate browser that says, I trust this site because of this person. And that gives you way more traceability, way more ability to have insight into the serious problems caused by all these different man-in-the-middle attacks. And I think it is fundamentally a better model that will have to be adopted in some form or another, because right now, when we talk about programming being a bit of a cargo cult, phenomenon, I do think cybersecurity is that as well. Because in my opinion, if someone understands why you're working on this, if somebody understands what the 30 million line problem is, which is part of the motivation for this, you would realize just how inevitably broken everything is. It's passe for people to say, oh, well, nothing's truly secure. And that's actually true. And what does that mean about all the people collecting big salaries to say, oh, yes, this system is secure, and it's a risk management. It's damage control on some level. But, and this is me not knocking cybersecurity professionals. I know they do a lot of serious work, because to be honest, there's a lot of low hanging fruit you can go after. If your server is not, secured properly, you can let in a whole lot more people than people otherwise. It's not an attack on individual professionals, but definitely on the bigger picture of why are we doing what we're doing? Why are cybersecurity companies not trying to move the entire technological landscape into this direction? And I feel this is what has given government so much of an in over technology, because now they're like, look at all these problems. We have no idea how you guys did this, but now we have to clean it up. And ironically, I don't think they're going to clean it up. I think they just want to grab the control, and then they'll be able to say, well, sorry, we did everything we could, but now you're on your own, basically, because they want to insulate themselves from your risk, not their risk. That's fundamentally how I see it. But this has been a phenomenal conversation. I've really enjoyed this. I was really excited all, week, looking forward to it. And I just want to ask, is there anything you'd like to leave people with? I know people can buy your device if you want to talk about how that's going, and just any closing thoughts.
Well, I think fundamentally that if there's one lesson I've learned thinking about all these different topics, it's that there's a surprising amount of multiplicative effect you get of. And if I'm going to redo everything from scratch to solve problem A, then you can also solve problem B, because the biggest cost of doing everything from scratch is that, I've alienated everybody. It's on a completely
Right.
different network. But if you do that once already, you've paid the cost. So now you can do the same thing for a different problem, and it's only upside. You keep doing that, and then suddenly you're in this situation where we can fix almost all these problems by rethinking and redesigning with 50 years of experience of computers at this point. And I think that to me, that's what the project fundamentally is. It's this hopefully lightning rod that can go in and just we can solve all these problems in one swoop, and because they'll be hard to do on their own, right? It's it's now or never. You do it now because it's cheap, because we're doing all these at once, because we only have to pay the cost once, and that's what's most exciting to me about it.
Yeah, I'm definitely really excited for this project to flourish. I'd really love, because I think as someone who's observing casually, you can learn a lot just from seeing it. As I'll mention again, if you want to learn more about Serenum, there's his website at samhsmith.com/Serenum. And also, if you want the device itself so that you can start playing around with the cutting edge of a new software and hardware ecosystem, it's also on taberna.shop. So thank you, Sam, for joining me. This has been a
Thank you.
pleasure, and I thank you all for listening. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation, and definitely feel free to leave any comments or questions or contact me directly. And Sam, you're welcome to join again anytime. I have really enjoyed this conversation. If you ever have new updates, definitely come back whenever you can.
Yeah.